A feared billionaire walked out of a ballroom full of powerful men because of one message on his phone. The ballroom at the Shilla was crowded with cameras, expensive fabric, and people who knew how to look relaxed without actually being relaxed. Cha Mingyum stood in the middle of it with a glass of water in one hand, while a vice chairman from a rival group tried to recover from the sentence Mingyum had just dropped on him. "If you had brought a serious offer," Mingyum said, his voice quiet enough to make the insult feel even colder, "I would have let you embarrass yourself somewhere private." Nobody moved. That was part of what made him so unnerving. He didn't have to perform power. He only had to stand there, say very little, and let other people feel small all by themselves. At 34, he ran Hanul Group with the kind of control people talked about in lowered voices. Hotels, aerospace, logistics, real estate, venture capital. His reach was wide enough to shape cities, and his temperament had already hardened into legend. Then his phone vibrated. He almost ignored it. Then he saw the name, Selena. No title, no formal phrasing, no careful distance. He pressed play. Her voice came through the speaker like she had every right in the world to interrupt his night. "If you're planning to spend another hour drinking water and disappointing rich people, that's your business. But your sea bass is getting cold, and I'm not reheating dinner for a billionaire who acts like salt is a security threat. 15 minutes. After that, I'm giving your plate to Mr. Bai." Min-yeom stared at the screen. Park Hun-seo, his executive assistant, noticed the change in his face before anyone else did. She had worked for him for 7 years. She knew irritation when she saw it. She knew calculation. She knew the silence that usually came right before somebody got ruined. This was something else. The vice chairman cleared his throat. "Chairman Cha, as I was saying," Min-jum slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to Won-seo. "Clear the rest of the evening." The man blinked. "We haven't finished." Min-jum finally looked at him. "That's the first correct thing you've said tonight." Then he walked out. He left a ballroom full of people who feared him because one woman had decided dinner mattered more than their agenda. 3 months earlier, Selena Vaughn had not known his name. She landed in Seoul with one overpacked suitcase, a contract she had read twice on the plane, and the kind of tiredness that sits in your bones long before it ever shows on your face. Back in Atlanta, she had become the person people called when things went wrong. Rent came up short. A schedule collapsed. Somebody's child needed watching. Somebody's grief needed carrying. Somebody's life needed holding together with calm hands and a steady voice. People saw that she was dependable and started treating that like an infinite resource. The Seoul contract looked simple enough on paper. A luxury operations firm needed someone to stabilize a private residence under Hanul Group ownership. Too many staff changes, too much inefficiency, too much silence around why the previous consultants never lasted. 6 months, excellent pay, strict confidentiality. She took it for the money. She took it because Seoul was far enough away to feel like interruption instead of escape. And if she was honest, she also took it because some small, reckless part of her wanted to know who she was when nobody around her had already assigned her a role. The residence sat at the top of one of Hanul's private towers overlooking the Han River. The driver sent to meet her introduced himself as Mr. Bai, the kind of older man who looked like he had spent years protecting other people's secrets from them. Selena flipped through the file in the back seat and frowned. "Your client difficult or just rich in a very organized way?" Mr. Bai smiled into the mirror and said nothing. That answer told her enough. The penthouse was less a home than a fully developed argument about control. Stone, glass, steel. Art chosen with confidence and displayed with precision. Everything looked spotless. Nothing felt warm. Han Soo-jin, the head house manager, greeted Selena near the entry with perfect posture and a face trained not to reveal unnecessary thought. "Ms. Vaughn, welcome. We're grateful for your assistance." "Selena is fine." A tiny pause. "Of course, the residence functions best when procedures are followed carefully." Selena looked toward the dining room where a 6-seat table held one exact place setting. "Does the owner actually live here? Or is everybody just maintaining ideal conditions for a ghost?" Mrs. Han's face changed. Mr. Bai studied the floor. Park Hun-seo, who had just entered from a side corridor with 2 phones and a leather folder, stopped walking. Then a man's voice came from behind Selena, so calm it lowered the temperature of the floor. "I live here." She turned. Photos had not done him justice, and that irritated her immediately. Cha Min-jeom was taller than she expected, leaner too, with the kind of stillness that looked less like self-control and more like a habit built under pressure. Black suit, no tie, expression unreadable, eyes sharp enough to make most people question themselves before they opened their mouths. Selena took him in once and said, "That explains the funeral energy." Nobody breathed. Min-jeom stared at her as if he was waiting for the room to correct what it had just heard. When nobody moved, he asked, "Excuse me?" "This place is beautiful," Selena replied, setting down her bag. "But it feels like no one here has blinked on purpose in years." Mrs. Han looked ready to disappear. Mr. Bay found a wall panel suddenly fascinating. Unseo's mouth almost twitched and then recovered. Min-jeom kept his eyes on Selena. "Who hired her?" "The firm you signed after firing 3 consultants," Selena answered before anyone else could. "According to the file, I'm here to improve operations, not admire your lighting." That should have ended her contract in the first 2 minutes. Instead, Min-jeom asked, "Do you always speak this way to clients?" "Only the ones living inside a luxury hostage situation." His stare settled harder on her. "This arrangement may not work." Selena shrugged. "Then fire me before I unpack." That was the first time Cha Min-jeom met a person who did not wrap fear in politeness and hand it back to him as respect. He hated the experience. Then he kept thinking about it. Selena lasted exactly 2 days before she started rearranging his life. The first thing she fixed was breakfast, because breakfast in that penthouse was a polished form of self-neglect. Black coffee, dry toast, fruit plated like apology. Everybody moved around the meal as if feeding one man required a chain of command and 3 approval stamps. On the 3rd morning, Min-jeom walked into the dining room and stopped. Sunlight had been let in. There was real food on the table. Warm food. Coffee that smelled like somebody actually expected it to be enjoyed. And beside his plate sat a small ceramic bowl of sea salt. Selena was on the floor near the sideboard with a stack of schedules, a pen tucked behind one ear, and a level of calm that should have been illegal in that house. Min-jeom looked at the table, then at her. "What is that?" "Salt." "I know what salt is." "That's encouraging." His stare sharpened. "Why is it on my table?" "Because your chef told me you eat like a man quietly punishing himself." Park Eun, standing near the doorway with the day's briefing, found the contents of her folder urgently interesting. Min-jeom looked back at the plate. "You changed breakfast." "Yes." "You changed the time." "Yes." "You opened the curtains." "Yes." Without asking, Selena rose and faced him. "You start your first meeting at 8:45. The elevator downstairs takes less time than your staff spends pretending it's complicated to feed you. Also, black coffee and 1 piece of toast isn't discipline. It's theater." He stood there a second too long, then he sat. Mrs. Han, watching from the corridor, nearly lost hold of the tray in her hands when he reached for the sea salt. By lunch, the story had moved through the penthouse like a security breach. He used it. The changes kept coming. Selena moved a chair 3 inches because people are not laser beams. She told the florist to stop sending white lilies because these flowers look like they expect condolences. She cut household protocols nearly in half and explained, gently but without compromise, that no private home should require 6 internal approvals for a changed dinner time unless the owner was secretly being held against his will. She found Min-jeom standing in a dark room reading reports one night and asked, "Do the lights work, or is the haunted executive thing a personal choice?" He looked up. "Do you insult all your employers this efficiently?" "Only the ones paying extra for emotional refrigeration." What unsettled him was not the defiance. Men like him were challenged all the time, usually by people who wanted something. Selena challenged him because she could not stand nonsense. That made her difficult. That also made her useful in a way he had not expected. Their daily skirmishes turned into a pattern the staff began quietly tracking. He would question a change, and she would answer with logic so plain that resisting her made him look childish. He would invoke protocol, and she would answer with basic human behavior. He would expect hesitation and get eye contact instead. One evening, she found him in the wine room reading a report while ignoring a bottle that looked old enough to have its own legal identity. "Do you do anything in this house that isn't aggressively lonely?" she asked. He closed the folder but didn't put it down. "That's a dramatic question." "Dramatic would be me asking whether this place came furnished with unresolved childhood issues." He looked at her for a long moment, as though his life had not prepared him for this volume of honesty. "And what answer would satisfy you? The honest one." He held her gaze longer than necessary. "I sleep here." Selena pressed a hand to her chest. "Well, thank God. I was starting to think you just toured your own penthouse like a museum donor." His mouth moved. "Barely. Enough," she pointed. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "That, nearly looking human. It'll destroy your brand." Park Yun-so had to leave the room because laughter was becoming an operational risk. The bigger problem began when Selena stopped being amusing and became necessary. Min-jeom noticed her absence in ways he disliked. The kitchen felt flatter when her voice wasn't in it. Dinner returned to perfect efficiency and lost whatever warmth had entered it since her arrival. Staff members slipped back into careful versions of themselves whenever she was off the floor, as though she had briefly reminded them this was supposed to be a home. He found the realization irritating. For 3 days he responded by becoming colder, shorter at meals, sharper with staff. Distant with Selena in a way that tried to pass for discipline, and failed because she was too observant for that. On the 3rd night, she followed him into the study and shut the door. "What is wrong with you?" Min-jeom looked up from his laptop. "That question lacks focus. You've spent 3 days acting like I offended your bloodline. I'm working. You're sulking. I do not sulk." Selena nodded. "Fine. Then whatever elegant billionaire version of sulking this is." His voice cooled. "You speak very freely for someone on a temporary contract." The sentence landed harder than he intended. She felt it, and so did he. Selena lowered her arms. "If you want me gone, say that plainly. If you hate the work, say that too. But don't spend 3 days punishing the oxygen because this house feels different when people are comfortable." Min-jeom rose from the desk with the calm kind of anger that worried everybody around him. "I am fully capable of controlling my own residence." "That," Selena said, "is exactly what scares you." He stopped. She stepped closer, not enough to challenge him physically, more than enough to challenge him honestly. "You know how to function when people are careful around you. You know what to do with admiration, fear, and obedience. But ease bothers you. A room where no one is bracing themselves, that gets under your skin." No one had ever said anything like that to him. Not because no one had noticed, because everybody who noticed understood the cost of naming it. Selena did it anyway. "I'm here to improve your home," she continued, her voice quieter now, "not tiptoe around your moods while you pretend this place felt alive before I got here." Then she left him alone with a truth he hated because it was accurate. That should have pushed him farther away from her. Instead, it lodged under his skin and stayed there. The first real crack in Cha Min-jeom happened after midnight. Selena woke to the sound of glass shattering on the floor above her. She sat up instantly. No raised voices, no second impact. Just silence pressing hard after the break. She pulled on a sweater and went upstairs. The study door was open. A whiskey tumbler had exploded against the wall. Min-jeom stood near the desk with one hand braced against the wood, breathing too fast. At first Selena thought anger. Then she looked properly. Panic, the quiet kind. The kind some people bury so deep it comes out looking like punishment. "Min-jeom," he didn't turn. "Leave." "Not happening. I said leave." "And I'm saying no." He faced her then, every inch of him controlled except the hand that shook once before he forced it still. "Do not make the mistake of thinking you understand what you're seeing." Selena stepped over the broken glass. "Then don't explain it." His breathing stayed ragged. She spoke the way she would have spoken to someone standing on the edge of a roof while pretending they were perfectly fine. "Sit down." A bitter laugh escaped him. "I'm not taking instructions from you. You already do. Sit." He stared at her, furious at the implication because it was true. Then he sat. Selena lowered herself to the rug across from him, not too close. She had spent enough of her life helping other people through bad moments to know when distance felt safer than touch. "Look at me," he refused. "Min-jeom?" Slowly, his eyes lifted. "Good. Breathe with me." He almost said no again. Pride reached him first. It always had. Selena inhaled and let the silence force him to choose what mattered more, his ego or his lungs. On the fourth breath, his body betrayed him and matched hers. On the seventh, the worst of the shaking eased. On the 10th, his shoulders lowered just enough to be noticed. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, he said, without looking at her, "You should not have come in." "Probably. And yet you did." "Yeah." He stared at the broken glass near the wall. "You're bad at following instructions." She leaned back on her hands. "You only say that because most of your instructions are terrible." That almost made him laugh. Almost. Selena let the almost happen. Then, very gently, she said, "You don't have to look fine in front of me." His eyes closed. That sentence changed the architecture between them. She had not asked for details. She had not reached for pity. She had only taken performance off the table. For a man who had spent half his life surviving by controlling what anyone could see, felt dangerously close to mercy. And if you've ever watched someone you care about hide behind competence, silence, or control because they don't know any other way to survive, you know exactly why that moment matters. Sometimes love doesn't begin with chemistry. Sometimes it begins the first time somebody feels safe enough to stop pretending. After that night, he started asking questions, not polite ones, real ones. Why she always carried too much by herself. Why Atlanta still lived in her voice even when she was tired. Why she seemed to know panic well enough to spot his without naming it. Selena answered some of them. Not all. She learned things too. He remembered everything people said and pretended he didn't. He hated flying overnight because the empty hours gave his mind too much room. He stood in dark rooms because silence felt easier to survive when he didn't also have to see his own reflection in the glass. Their late-night conversations became a pattern. Tea in the kitchen after staff hours, short walks on the upper terrace, pauses in the private gallery that lasted too long to be accidental. The staff noticed the changes before either of them named them. He came home earlier. He lingered in rooms where she was talking. He asked for her opinion on things that had nothing to do with household operations. Mrs. Han noticed first, Mr. Bay noticed second. Unso noticed everything. One evening, Selena walked into the dining room and stopped. Peach cobbler sat in the center of the table. She looked at the dessert, then at Min-gyeom, then back at the dessert. "You had the pastry chef make this." He stood by the window in a dark sweater, pretending with heroic bad faith that the entire scene had nothing to do with him. "The pastry chef made it. In Seoul. There are ovens in Seoul. That is not what I mean." He kept his eyes on the city. "You mentioned once that your grandmother made it for your birthday. The chef said it was possible. That should not have hit her as hard as it did. It did. Because loud men were easy, showy men were easy. Men who made a production out of affection announced themselves too early." Min-gyeom listened. He remembered. He acted when he could do something specific with what he remembered. That kind of attention gets under the skin fast, especially if you've spent enough of your life being useful that you've forgotten what it feels like to be carefully noticed. Mrs. Han, watching discreetly from the doorway, carried the empty plates back to the kitchen later and told the chef, with the gravity of a woman reporting on state matters, he is finished, entirely. If he had already started losing control, the rooftop after the rain finished the job. Seoul glittered below them like it had been polished for effect. The river wore the city like jewelry. The air still smelled faintly of wet stone and night. Selena stood beneath the edge of the awning and looked out over the bridges. "You've had this the whole time? And you chose to spend your evenings downstairs in a luxury crypt?" "This is quieter," he said. "So is being buried." His mouth shifted, that almost smile again. It came easier now around her, and every time it happened, she felt a ridiculous little pulse of pride. Min-gyeom watched the wind catch the edge of her hair. "I come here because no one can reach me." Selena turned to him. "Do you ever get tired of that?" He took longer than usual to answer. "Often." The honesty landed with more force than any rehearsed vulnerability ever could. She stepped closer. "For a man with such a terrifying reputation, you're mostly just tired." He looked at her mouth. She looked at his. The distance between them thinned. His phone rang. Both of them froze. He answered without taking his eyes fully off her. "What?" Yunso's voice came through clipped and efficient. A photographer caught you leaving the museum annex with Miss Vaughn yesterday. The image has reached 2 desks already. One of them won't sit on it. The moment broke cleanly. Mingyum's face shut down. Selena felt it too, the shift from private warmth to public consequence. His world had noticed her. The article hit by morning. A grainy photograph, suggestive language, just enough detail to provoke speculation and not enough to invite a clean legal strike. Mystery woman linked to Hanul chairman. Questions about access, questions about judgment, questions, most dangerously, about where his discipline might be weaker than the market had assumed. By noon, his grandmother had requested tea. By evening, 3 directors had called Unso. By nightfall, the residents felt watched. Mingyum reacted the way he always reacted under pressure. He tightened everything, more security, more protocols, more oversight. People moved around Selena differently now, too careful, too alert, too obviously trying not to let her notice that the penthouse had become a monitored zone. At first she tried to ignore it, then her ride requests started changing without her approval. A meeting with a former colleague got canceled because security suddenly deemed the restaurant unsuitable. A recruiter who had seemed enthusiastic about her future options wrote to say they understood she planned to remain in her current protected environment. Protected environment. Selena read the phrase twice. Then a third time. Her whole body went cold in the silent, dangerous way. When Mingyum came home that evening, she was waiting in the dining room with the printed email in one hand. He saw her face and knew instantly. Still, he asked, "What happened?" She held out the page. "You tell me." He read it, said nothing. The silence confirmed what she had not wanted to believe. "You interfered with my work. It was a precaution. A precaution. You were exposed. People were watching you. So you told them I was unavailable. You told them I was staying here. I redirected one situation." She laughed once, broken and furious. "You redirected my life." He took a step toward her. "I was trying to keep you safe." That was the sentence he believed. That was why it landed so hard. Selena looked at him with hurt so sharp it made every word cleaner. "You were trying to keep me where you could see me." Mingyum stopped moving. Her eyes shone, but she did not look fragile. She looked insulted all the way down to the soul. "I've spent too much of my life making sure no one decides things for me without my permission," she said. "Not family, not bosses, not men with money who think their fear is noble. You do not get to call it protection because that word sounds cleaner. It was not about control. Yes, it was. You just prefer the version where control wears a tailored suit and calls itself concern." He had no good answer, only the reflex that always arrived first. "I can fix this." Selena closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, something in her had gone still. "That," she told him, "is the problem." By morning, she was gone. The penthouse changed shape without her in it. The curtains stayed closed longer. Meals returned to perfect efficiency and lost all warmth. The kitchen fell quiet in the worst way. Mrs. Han stopped hearing laughter. Mr. Bay drove through silence thick enough to bruise. Park Yunso watched her employer become even more efficient than usual, which worried her more than rage would have. Mingyum did not collapse. Men like him rarely do. He optimized. He cut underperforming divisions, compressed meetings, made 2 senior directors regret waking up on the wrong side of his fiscal quarter. The board called him sharper than ever. The staff thought he looked like a house reoccupied by winter. He noticed her everywhere. The blue ceramic bowl by the entry where she had ordered people to put their keys before somebody loses one and blames capitalism. The chair she had moved, the cookbook left in the kitchen with notes in the margin, the sea salt. He wanted to move the bowl. He never touched it. Selena, in a temporary apartment across the river arranged through her firm, was not doing much better. She knew she had done the right thing. That didn't stop her from reaching for her phone at stupid hours or replaying every good moment until it turned against her. The hardest part was that his love had been real, misused, damaging, real anyway. That kind of grief never makes itself simple. Anyone who has ever left someone and still missed them knows how cruel that is. You can be completely right and still feel like your chest has been split open. A week after she left, Park Hunsa walked into Mingyum's office with a file and said, "Director Lim met with your grandmother before the leak." His eyes lifted. Unso kept going. He also contacted 2 external recruiters. He wanted Ms. Vaughn professionally isolated. It strengthened the case for the strategic alliance your grandmother prefers. An So-yun? Min-gyum said. Unso nodded. He set the file down with microscopic care. Did Selena know? No. Does this reduce what I did? Unso met his eyes steadily. She had served him too long to offer comfort when truth was required. No. That answer mattered. Director Lim had manipulated the environment. His grandmother had shaped the pressure. But none of that changed the choice Min-gyum himself had made. Pressure explained him. It did not absolve him. After Unseo left, he sat alone with a draft he had been hiding even from himself. 3 weeks earlier, after the rooftop in the rain, he had begun outlining a restructuring plan that would remove residential oversight from family control, reduce ceremonial obligations, and put distance between his private life and the machinery that had raised him. He had started changing before he knew he had a reason. Then the first real test came, and he reached for the old language anyway. That was the part that sickened him. Not simply that he had hurt her. What sickened him was how close he had come to becoming better before failing in the one place that mattered most. The board meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon and was meant to look polite. Governance review, reputational management, leadership optics. In plain language, wealthy people deciding whether a man's private life threatened the value of their money. His grandmother sat at the far end of the table in silk and authority. An So-yun was there too, elegant and self-contained, invited less as a person than as a strategy. Director after director spoke in bloodless corporate euphemisms. Stability, perception, appropriate boundaries, public reassurance. Then his grandmother said, "You have allowed a temporary employee to become a matter of discussion. This is beneath you." The younger version of Cha Min-gyum would have answered with colder language and cleaner violence. He would have protected his image by keeping every vulnerable truth out of reach. Instead, he looked around the table and understood that if he did that now, he would confirm every lesson that had ruined him in the first place. So he said, "No. What was beneath me was treating another adult's life as something I could arrange for my own peace of mind." The room went silent. His grandmother's face hardened. "This is not the place for emotional theater?" "It's the place where this family mistakes control for care," Min-gyum replied, "and teaches men like me to do the same." No one interrupted him, not because they agreed. Shock reached them first. He continued, each sentence cleaner than the last. "I interfered with Selena Vaughn's professional choices without her consent. I called it protection because that word was easier to live with than the truth. It was control." So-yun lowered her eyes. One director actually leaned back in his chair as though honesty itself had become aggressive. Min-gyum slid a folder toward General Counsel. "Residential governance is leaving family supervision. The alliance discussions are over. Any further review of my private life that requires a woman's dignity as collateral ends here." His grandmother's voice cooled into something almost ceremonial. "You would speak to me this way over a stranger." There it was. The old question hiding inside all the money, the posture, the power. Who is worth disobeying the structure for? Min-gyum answered without hesitation. "Not over a stranger, over someone I should have treated better." That was the moment the room lost him, or perhaps the moment he finally belonged less to it. Selena learned pieces of what happened before she learned all of it. Recruiters who had gone cold resurfaced with awkward apologies. A freelance client in Atlanta admitted that an external party had interfered. Then Park Yoon-seo appeared at her apartment with no flowers, no legal language, and no transportation waiting downstairs. Just herself. Selena let her in. They sat by the window with tea between them. Yoon-seo rested her hands around the cup and said, "I'm not here to persuade you to return." "That's good," Selena answered. "It would be a short visit." A faint smile flickered across Yoon-seo's face and disappeared. He knows precisely what he did. Selena looked at the tea rather than the woman across from her. "That must be very clarifying for him." "It is miserable for him," Yoon-seo said, "which is deserved. But misery is not why I'm here. I'm here because, for once, he is trying not to use power as apology." She placed a folded note on the table. Selena waited before touching it. Then she unfolded the page. The handwriting was his. clean, direct, unadorned. I made decisions about your life because I was afraid of losing you. I called it protection because that sounded less ugly than the truth. Control has been my first language for so long that I used it on someone who should only have received respect. You were right. Your choice mattered more than my fear. I am not asking you to forgive me inside this letter. I have already taken too much control of too many moments. I only wanted to say the exact thing clearly. What I did was wrong, why I did it was not noble, and if you never speak to me again, you will still have been the most honest thing that ever entered my life. Selena read it twice, then set it down very carefully and cried in the quiet way people cry when precision reaches somewhere vague. Apologies never could. He had not defended himself. He had not asked for an answer. He had not tried to solve her emotions for her. For the first time since she met him, he had told the truth without managing the outcome. She still didn't call right away. That delay mattered. A story like this falls apart if pain vanishes the second the right words arrive. Selena took 3 days. 3 days to remain angry. 3 days to admit that another part of her hurt had nothing to do with his money and everything to do with how much she had wanted to stay before he earned that right. Competence had always been her armor. She knew how to be useful. She knew how to be strong. She knew how to leave. Staying long enough to demand a better version of love required a different kind of courage. On the 4th evening, she texted him one line and no greeting. Han River Park, 8:30. He arrived early. Of course he did. He stood by the water in a dark coat, posture composed enough to fool strangers and no one else. Selena walked toward him under the river lights, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was too much truth in the air for anything careless. Minjeom broke first. "I'm sorry," Selena nodded once. "I know. I needed to say it out loud. Then say it properly." He did not rush. He had learned enough to know that speed was its own form of pressure. "I loved you badly," he said. "Not falsely. Badly. I saw threat and reached for control before I reached for trust. I do not know how to value something halfway. That is not your burden to carry. It is my flaw." Selena looked at him for a long time. "Do you know what made me angriest?" "Tell me." "That I loved you enough for it to hurt that much." He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the blow and the grace hidden inside it. She looked out over the river. "Part of me has always kept one foot out of the room, emotionally. Even when I stay, it feels safer. What you did made me feel stupid for ever wanting more than that." Minjeom listened without interrupting. That, more than the apology, made her believe change might actually be possible. "I'm not asking you to become easy overnight," Selena said. "I know who you are. I know what shaped you. But I cannot be with a man who confuses access with love." "You won't be." She looked back at him. "Careful. Promises sound cheap after regret." He accepted that too. "Then let me say it differently. I will ask, not decide. And if I fail, you will hear the truth from me before you have to drag it out." That was the first answer that sounded lived in rather than polished. Selena stepped closer. "So what happens now?" He looked at her as though the question carried more power than any board vote he had ever survived. "Now I wait for what you want." She held his gaze for one long beat. Then she smiled, faintly, because growth deserved some reward. "Right now," she said, "I want you to kiss me." This time he didn't take anything by force, not even the moment. His hand rose gently to her face, and when he kissed her, it felt different from the almost kiss on the rooftop. Less collision. More choice. If you had been Selena, would that apology have been enough, or would the interference have been the line you never uncrossed? Be honest. This is exactly where people split. The last test came 2 weeks later, after the reunion and before comfort had time to turn courage into routine. A second wave of press attention hit when details of the board restructuring leaked. Business channels speculated that the chairman's personal instability had forced concessions. One older director suggested, in private and with the oily confidence of a man who had never been properly corrected, that Selena should remain out of sight until the story cooled. The old Minjeom would have understood that logic instantly. Hide what can be used against you, control what can be seen, protect the asset, keep the damage measurable. Instead, he invited the press to the opening of a youth design initiative funded through Hanol's foundation. a project Selena had once sketched on the back of a dinner menu while ranting that beautiful spaces should not be reserved for rich people who used them badly. He arrived in a dark suit. Selena arrived beside him. She was not behind him. She was not being hidden. She was not being managed. A reporter called out, "Chairman Cha, is the woman beside you connected to the governance dispute?" Min-jeom answered before anyone else could arrange the air. "The woman beside me is Selena Vaughn. She is a consultant whose work improved my residence, my foundation planning, and my thinking. Any dispute was mine to answer for, not hers to disappear under." The flashes came faster. Another reporter shouted, "Are you confirming a relationship?" Min-jeom glanced once at Selena. He was not borrowing permission for her name. He was meeting her there. She gave the smallest nod. He looked back at the cameras. "I'm confirming respect." That landed harder than a declaration would have. Men with his level of power rarely offered respect first. That was the point. Later, inside the exhibit hall, Selena leaned toward him and murmured, "That was dangerously close to charm." He kept his eyes on the display. "I'm hoping it passes." She laughed softly. "Don't get reckless." Near the entrance, Park Hyun-soo handed a folded bill to Mr. Bae without taking her eyes off them. Mrs. Han noticed and asked, horrified, "You made a wager?" Hyun-soo slid the rest of the money back into her purse. "Respectfully, we all did." For a few weeks, it almost felt easy. That was what made the final turn dangerous. The penthouse no longer felt preserved. It felt lived in. Music drifted from the kitchen some evenings. The florist stopped sending arrangements that looked funereal. The blue bowl by the entry survived everything. A chair remained permanently out of alignment because Selena insisted any room worth living in should show evidence of living. Mrs. Han laughed more. Mr. Bae developed opinions about dessert. Park Hyun-soo became visibly more dangerous because humor had entered her bloodstream and sharpened her timing, and Min-jeom remained himself, exacting, difficult, brilliant, still capable of freezing a boardroom with one sentence when needed. The difference was that his life no longer orbited defense alone. One evening, he sat in a high-level meeting on the 63rd floor while 3 directors presented acquisition models dense enough to drain color from the walls. His phone vibrated once against the polished table. He looked down. "Selena, if you miss dinner again, I'm not saving your plate. Also, Mrs. Han says if you make the chef wait past 9, she's joining a labor movement." Min-jeom read it once and closed the folder in front of him. A director paused mid-sentence. Park Hyun-soo, seated 2 chairs down, did not bother hiding the anticipation in her eyes. Min-jeom stood. "Reschedule the rest." "Chairman," one director said carefully, "we still have the final projections. Tomorrow." He buttoned his jacket. The director hesitated. "May we ask why?" Min-jeom looked at him with complete calm. "I'm expected." Then he left. When he reached the penthouse, Selena was in the kitchen arguing with the chef about spice levels with the seriousness of a trade negotiator. She turned at the sound of his steps. "You're late. By 4 minutes. For people who like hot food, that's late." He set his keys in the blue ceramic bowl. Then he walked over, looked at her for 1 quiet second, and kissed her before answering. "That," Selena told him when he drew back, "was a distraction." "Yes, it almost worked. I can improve," she smiled. The penthouse answered with warmth from every direction. And then Park Hyun-soo's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, and the color in her face changed so slightly that only Mrs. Han caught it. "Unseo?" Mrs. Han asked. Hyun-soo looked toward the kitchen, where Selena was laughing at something the chef had said, and Min-jeom was standing closer to her than he ever stood near anybody without armor. For 1 suspended second, Hyun-soo let herself watch the scene as if it might be the last uncomplicated one they got. Then she stepped into the corridor and answered. When she came back, the warmth in the penthouse was still there. So was the problem. Mr. Bae looked at her face and understood immediately. "What happened?" Hyun-soo lowered her voice. 3 activist funds just aligned against the chairman. Someone leaked internal projections and tied the restructuring to personal compromise. She glanced toward the kitchen. "His grandmother is calling an emergency session at 9. Mrs. Han went still. "Tonight? Tonight?" From the kitchen, Selena's voice floated out, bright and easy. "If you're both whispering about dessert, the answer is yes. Make more." Hyun-soo looked toward the sound and then back at the dark screen in her hand. The story was not over, not for the board, not for the family, not for the men who had mistaken Minjeom's change for weakness and planned to price it accordingly. He was finally home. He had also just become easier to target. Unseo slipped the phone into her pocket and drew one steadying breath. In the kitchen, Selena was still smiling. Minjeom had not seen her face yet. He had not heard what was coming. For one more second, he was just a man in his own home, standing too close to the woman who had taught him how to live inside it. Then he turned and saw Unseo watching him. He knew immediately. Not the details, the shape of it. The next fight had arrived. And this time he had something to lose. That power could not simply rebuild once broken. So here's the real question. If love finally makes a man more human, and the world around him prefers him made of steel, which one survives the collision?